He thought he was protecting the image of a luxury restaurant, but in reality, he was about to expose exactly why he didn't belong there. Jason Miller's voice cut sharply across the dining room, loud enough to turn heads and pause conversations mid-sentence as he looked directly at the woman standing near the entrance, his eyes scanning her from her worn sneakers to her simple jacket with a faint, dismissive smirk that had become second nature after years of working in a place where appearance meant everything and judgment came faster than service. And in that moment, Emily Carter didn't look like someone who belonged among the polished marble floors, the soft glow of crystal chandeliers, and the quiet hum of expensive conversations measured in deals and status rather than words. But what Jason didn't see, what no one in that room could possibly understand yet, was that the quiet woman he was about to embarrass had built every inch of that room with decisions they would never even comprehend. 20 minutes earlier, Emily had stood outside the restaurant, her eyes resting briefly on the name etched in gold above the glass doors, a name she hadn't seen up close in nearly a year, not because it wasn't hers, but because she preferred to stay invisible, to let the place operate without her presence shaping how people behaved. Because she had learned long ago that the truest measure of a business wasn't how people acted when they knew who was watching, but how they treated those they believed had no power at all. And today, for reasons even she hadn't fully explained to herself, she decided to walk in unannounced, dressed the way she always did when she wasn't expected to impress anyone, comfortable, simple, real. The moment she stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted in subtle ways most people wouldn't notice. A hostess hesitating half a second too long before greeting her, a waiter glancing quickly at her shoes before forcing a polite smile, a couple seated nearby lowering their voices just enough to whisper, and all of it built into a quiet pattern Emily recognized instantly, not angering her, not surprising her, just confirming what she already knew about how easily perception shaped behavior. But Jason, standing near the center of the room like a self-appointed gatekeeper of elegance, didn't deal in subtlety. He dealt in control, in making quick decisions about who belonged and who didn't. And as soon as his eyes locked onto Emily, he moved with purpose, stepping between her and the hostess, as if intercepting a mistake before it could happen, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor with a confidence that came from believing he was always right. "Can I help you?" he asked. But the question carried no real invitation, only assumption. And before Emily could respond, his gaze flicked toward the menu in her hand and back to her face, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly as he added, "Just so you know, our average entree runs about $40 to $60, his tone carefully measured, but loud enough for nearby tables to hear. And just like that, the room leaned in, not openly, not rudely, but with the quiet curiosity people have when they sense something uncomfortable unfolding. A few glances exchanged, a fork paused mid-air, a conversation slowed just enough to catch the next line, and Emily felt it all without reacting, her posture steady, her expression calm, her silence doing more than any defense ever could, because she wasn't surprised, she wasn't offended, she was observing, letting the moment unfold exactly as it wanted to. Because sometimes the most revealing thing you can do is give people enough space to show you who they really are. And Jason, mistaking her silence for uncertainty, leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice just enough to sound controlled while still carrying across the polished room. "Maybe there's a place down the street that would be more comfortable for you," he said. And that was the moment the air shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet tension that settled over the room like a held breath. Because something about Emily didn't match the situation he thought he was controlling. Something in the way she stood there, unshaken, unhurried, as if the outcome of this interaction had already been decided long before he opened his mouth. And as Jason straightened his jacket, preparing to end the conversation on his terms, Emily slowly lifted her eyes to meet his, calm, steady, and far more certain than anyone in that room expected. And for the first time since he approached her, Jason hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, though he didn't yet understand why. Jason felt it before he understood it. That subtle shift in control that experienced people recognize but rarely admit. The moment when a situation they believe they own begins to slip quietly out of their hands. And for a fraction of a second, standing under the warm glow of the chandeliers with dozens of eyes subtly watching. He questioned his own read of the situation, but pride has a way of silencing instinct. And Jason had built his reputation on never backing down once he made a judgment. So instead of stepping back, he leaned further into it, straightening his posture as if to reinforce his authority, his voice tightening just enough to carry across the nearby tables. "Look, I am trying to be polite here, but we have standards," he said, emphasizing the last word as though it carried weight beyond policy, and a soft ripple moved through the room, not laughter exactly, but recognition of the familiar dynamic, the kind that made people uncomfortable yet unable to look away, because everyone understood what was happening even if no one would say it out loud. And Emily noticed it all, the way a couple at the corner table exchanged a glance, the way a server paused mid-step pretending to adjust a tray just to listen, the way silence stretched just long enough to make every word feel sharper. And still she did not react, because she had seen this pattern too many times in too many places, not just here, not just today, but in meetings, in partnerships, in rooms where people assumed power based on appearances and forgot that real authority rarely announces itself. And Jason, misreading her calm as hesitation, took one more step forward, lowering his voice slightly, but not enough to hide the edge. "If you cannot afford to dine here, there is no shame in that," he continued. "But this is not the place to experiment." And that was the moment the tension crystallized. The moment when discomfort in the room shifted into something heavier, something that made even those who had been quietly observing feel the weight of what was being said, because now it was no longer subtle, no longer implied. It was direct, unmistakable, and for the first time, Emily moved, not quickly, not dramatically, just a small, deliberate motion as she closed the menu in her hands and let it rest against her side. Her fingers relaxed, her posture unchanged, but her presence somehow more defined, as if the silence around her belonged to her now rather than the man speaking over it. And when she spoke, her voice was not loud. It did not need to be, because the room was already listening. "You seem very certain about who belongs here," she said, her tone even, almost curious, and something about the way she said it caused a faint crease to form between Jason's brows. Because it did not sound defensive, it did not sound offended. It sounded measured, controlled, as if she were evaluating him rather than the other way around. But again, he pushed past it, forcing a small laugh that felt just slightly too sharp. "It is part of my job," he replied, gesturing subtly to the room around them, to the polished surfaces, the tailored suits, the quiet conversations that defined what he believed this place represented. "We maintain a certain atmosphere." And Emily nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging a point he had made, though her eyes did not leave his, steady and clear in a way that began to draw more attention than his voice ever had. And in that moment, the balance shifted again, subtle but undeniable, because the room was no longer watching her. It was watching him, waiting to see what he would do next, how far he would take it. And Jason, feeling that attention without fully understanding why it had changed, made the decision that would define everything that followed, turning slightly toward the security guard stationed near the entrance and giving a small, dismissive nod, the kind that required no words, the kind that said enough on its own. And as the guard began to move, hesitant but obedient, Emily tilted her head just slightly, a faint expression crossing her face that was not quite amusement, not quite disappointment, but something in between, something that suggested this was exactly the point she had been waiting for. And when she spoke again, it was softer than before, almost gentle, but it carried through the room with a clarity that stopped the guard mid-step and caused Jason's hand to pause halfway through adjusting his sleeve. "Before you go any further," she said, "you might want to call the owner." And the words hung in the air, simple, unadorned, and for a brief moment, Jason actually smiled. A quick, dismissive reaction born from complete certainty, because in his mind, this was the easiest part of the situation, the part where he would prove himself right without question. "I am the one in charge right now," he replied, his confidence returning in full. But Emily did not respond immediately. She only held his gaze for a second longer, just long enough for something unfamiliar to settle beneath his certainty. Something quiet, something he could not quite name. And then, without raising her voice, without changing her posture, She said the words that would begin to unravel everything he believed about that room. "No," she said calmly. "You are not." The moment she said it, something invisible snapped in the room, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the way conversations die without warning and attention shifts without permission, because confidence that does not need to prove itself carries a weight people feel before they understand, and Jason felt it now. That same subtle unease from earlier, only stronger, pressing against the certainty he had relied on just seconds ago. But instead of stepping back, he reacted the only way he knew how, with a short, sharp laugh that sounded more forced than he intended. "I think you are confused," he said, glancing briefly around the room as if to gather support from the silent witnesses. "The owner is not someone who just walks in off the street." And a few heads nodded faintly, not in agreement, but in habit, because it was easier to align with authority than question it. And for a moment, it seemed like the balance might shift back in his favor. But Emily did not move, did not flinch, did not even blink as she held his gaze, her calm now impossible to ignore. And when she spoke again, it was not louder, but it carried further, cutting cleanly through the tension that had settled over the dining room. "Then call them," she said simply, and the simplicity of it unsettled him more than any argument could have, because there was no emotion to push against, no defensiveness to dismiss, just a quiet certainty that did not match the situation he believed he controlled. And Jason hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, before reaching for the small device clipped to his belt, pressing the button with a motion that was slightly sharper than necessary. "Can I get a manager to the front?" he said, his tone tight, controlled. And for a moment, nothing happened, just the soft hum of the room holding its breath, the faint clink of glass somewhere in the background, the quiet shifting of guests who suddenly found themselves invested in something they had not expected when they sat down for dinner. And then, from the far side of the restaurant, a figure appeared, moving quickly but with purpose, a senior manager, older, composed, the kind of presence that did not need to raise its voice to be taken seriously. And as he approached, his eyes moved from Jason to Emily, and in that instant, everything changed, not gradually, not subtly, but all at once, because recognition is not something you can hide. It arrives fully formed, and the moment his eyes met hers, his expression shifted, his posture straightening in a way that had nothing to do with formality and everything to do with understanding exactly who was standing in front of him. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice dropping just slightly, not out of fear, but out of respect, and the name moved through the room like a quiet ripple, unfamiliar to most, but heavy enough to register, and Jason felt it before he processed it. The way the energy around him changed, the way the room no longer aligned with him but moved past him, beyond him, and for the first time since this interaction began, he did not have control of it. "I was not informed you would be visiting today," the manager continued, his tone careful, measured, and Emily offered a small nod. Nothing dramatic, nothing performative, just acknowledgement. "That was intentional," she replied, and there was no accusation in her voice, no anger, just a statement of fact that somehow carried more weight than any confrontation could have, and the silence that followed was absolute. The kind that makes every small movement feel amplified, the kind that leaves no room for misunderstanding, and Jason stood there, the words catching somewhere between his thoughts and his voice, his mind racing to reconcile what he was hearing with what he believed just moments ago, because the reality in front of him no longer matched the assumptions he had built his authority on. And when he finally spoke, it was quieter, uncertain in a way that did not fit him. "You are saying," he began, but the sentence did not finish because it did not need to. The answer was already clear, not just to him, but to everyone in the room. And Emily, still calm, still composed, met his gaze one last time, not with triumph, not with anger, but with something far more unsettling, clarity. "I am saying," she said, her voice steady, "that you just decided who belongs here without ever asking who built it." And the words settled over the room like a final verdict, leaving no space for denial, no room for recovery. And in that moment, surrounded by the same marble floors and polished elegance he had used to define his authority, Jason Miller realized that the only thing he had truly revealed was himself. The silence did not break all at once. It unraveled slowly, like tension releasing thread by thread, but the weight of it remained, pressing down on every person in that room as they recalibrated what they thought they understood just moments ago. And Jason stood at the center of it, no longer the one controlling the situation, but the one being quietly observed. His confidence no longer anchored in certainty, but drifting in something far less stable. And for the first time in a long while, he did not know what to say next, because the rules he had relied on had just shifted without warning, and the authority he had worn so comfortably now felt exposed, incomplete, and the senior manager, still standing beside Emily with composed respect, did not rush to fill the silence. Because moments like this do not need noise, they need clarity, and when he finally spoke, his voice was calm but firm. "Miss Carter founded this restaurant 3 years ago," he said, not loudly, but clearly enough that every table within earshot absorbed the words, and the statement moved through the room with quiet force, reshaping every glance, every assumption, every judgment that had been made in the last 10 minutes. And Jason felt it all collapse inward at once, the image he had tried to protect now revealing something far more uncomfortable, not about her, but about him, and his mouth opened slightly as if to respond, but no words came. Because there was nothing left to defend, nothing left to explain that would not only confirm what had already been exposed, and Emily watched him, not with satisfaction, not with anger, but with a calm that made the moment even heavier, because she was not here to humiliate him. She was here to understand him, and that was far more unsettling. And when she finally spoke, her voice was steady, almost reflective. "I built this place to see how people treat others when they think no one important is watching," she said, her eyes briefly scanning the room before returning to him. And today answered that question very clearly. And there was no accusation in her tone, only truth, and that made it impossible to argue with, impossible to dismiss, because it did not rely on opinion, it relied on what had just happened in front of everyone. And Jason felt something shift inside him, not defensiveness, not anger, but recognition, the kind that arrives quietly and settles deeply. And for a moment, he looked around the room, really looked this time, at the people who had been watching, at the staff who had paused, at the space he had believed he understood so completely, and he realized that everything he had done had not protected the restaurant standards. It had revealed his own, and the difference between the two was something he could no longer ignore. And the senior manager stepped slightly forward, not to take control, but to restore balance. "We will handle this appropriately," he said carefully, his tone measured, and Emily gave a small nod, not as approval, but as acknowledgement, because what happened next was not about punishment, it was about consequence, and consequence, when handled correctly, does not need to be loud to be lasting. And Jason straightened slightly, his posture no longer driven by authority, but by something quieter, something more grounded. And when he finally spoke, his voice was lower than before, stripped of the sharp edge it once carried. "I made an assumption," he said, the words simple, direct, and for the first time, honest. And the room seemed to shift again, not with tension, but with something closer to understanding, because accountability, when it is real, changes the way a moment settles. And Emily held his gaze for a second longer before responding, her expression unchanged, but her presence unmistakably clear. "Yes," she said softly. "And assumptions have a way of showing us who we are before we realize it ourselves." And the words did not linger as a reprimand. They settled as a reflection, something that would remain long after the room returned to normal. And slowly, the energy began to move again, conversations resuming in quieter tones, glasses lifted, forks returned to plates, but nothing felt exactly the same, because everyone who had witnessed that moment carried something away from it. Not just the shock of the reveal, but the understanding behind it. And as Emily turned slightly, preparing to move deeper into the restaurant she had built, she paused just long enough to add one final sentence, not to Jason alone, but to the room itself. "Respect is not something you reserve for certain people," she said calmly. "It is something you show to everyone, or it does not mean anything at all." And then she continued forward, her steps quiet against the marble floor, leaving behind a silence that no longer felt tense, but thoughtful, the kind of silence that lingers, because it has something worth remembering. What happened next was not loud, not dramatic. but it was the kind of shift that changes everything without anyone needing to raise their voice. Because once truth settles into a room, it does not leave quietly. It stays, reshaping how people see, how they think, how they remember. And as Emily Carter moved deeper into the restaurant, her presence no longer unnoticed, no longer dismissed. The staff who had once glanced past her now straightened instinctively, not out of fear, but out of recognition, and the same space that had judged her moments ago now adjusted itself around her, revealing something that had always been there but rarely acknowledged, that respect, when real, does not depend on status, it responds to it. And Jason remained where he stood, the weight of the moment settling fully into him now, not as embarrassment, but as clarity, the kind that strips away excuses and leaves only understanding behind. And he watched as Emily paused near one of the tables, speaking quietly with a server who nodded attentively, her tone calm, her demeanor unchanged, as if nothing about the situation had been personal, as if this had never been about proving anything, only about revealing something. And that realization settled deeper than any reprimand could have, because it forced him to confront not just what he had done, but why he had done it. And the answer was no longer hidden behind policy or procedure. It was simple, uncomfortable, undeniable. He had judged without knowing. And in doing so, he had defined himself more clearly than he had defined anyone else. And the senior manager turned slightly toward him, not with anger, not with urgency, but with a quiet expectation, the kind that does not demand reaction but invites reflection. And Jason nodded once, a small gesture, but a genuine one, because for the first time, he understood that this moment was not about defending his position, it was about redefining it. And across the room, conversations resumed, but they carried a different tone now, softer, more thoughtful, as if everyone present had witnessed something they could not quite put into words, but would not easily forget. And a woman at a nearby table leaned slightly toward her companion, whispering something that ended with a faint shake of her head, not in judgment of Emily, but in reflection of what had just unfolded. And a server who had paused earlier now moved again, but with a subtle shift in awareness, as if every interaction carried more weight than it had before. And Emily, finishing her quiet exchange, turned slightly, her gaze moving briefly across the room before settling once more on Jason, not lingering, not pressing, just acknowledging. And in that brief moment, there was no tension, no imbalance, only understanding, the kind that does not need to be spoken to be felt. And she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not as approval, not as forgiveness, but as recognition that the moment had served its purpose. And Jason inhaled slowly, steadying himself, because he understood now that what he did next mattered more than what had already happened. And as he adjusted his jacket, not out of habit, but with intention, he stepped forward, not toward authority, but toward responsibility. And the room, though quieter now, seemed to notice, not in obvious ways, but in the subtle shift of attention that follows genuine change. And Emily continued walking, her steps measured, her presence grounded, not elevated by status, but defined by it in a way that required no announcement. And as she reached the center of the restaurant, the chandeliers above casting a warm glow across the polished space she had once imagined from nothing, she paused for just a moment, her eyes taking in the room not as a stranger, not as a guest, but as someone who understood exactly what it meant. And in that stillness, the lesson of the moment settled fully into place, not just for Jason, not just for the staff, but for everyone who had witnessed it. Because sometimes the most powerful change does not come from being corrected, it comes from being seen clearly. And in that moment, the restaurant was no longer just a place of polished surfaces and quiet conversations. It became something else entirely, a reflection of the people within it, and a reminder that dignity is not something you grant when it is convenient. It is something you carry into every interaction, or you do not carry it at all. And as the room slowly returned to motion, the silence it left behind was not empty. It was meaningful, the kind that lingers because it has something worth remembering. He would remember this moment far longer than any shift he had ever worked, not because of what was said, but because of what was revealed. And as the restaurant slowly returned to its rhythm, the quiet clink of silverware and low conversations filling the space again, Jason Miller stood with a new awareness that did not fade with movement. It followed him, settling into every step he took, every glance he received, every decision he was about to make. And for the first time since he had taken this role, he was not thinking about maintaining standards or controlling perception. He was thinking about understanding people, something he had assumed he was already doing but now realized he had never truly practiced. And across the room, Emily Carter moved with the same quiet confidence she had entered with, but now every detail of her presence was seen differently, not because she had changed, but because everyone else had, and that difference was everything. And as she approached the open kitchen area, a chef who had been observing from a distance stepped forward slightly, his posture respectful, his tone measured, asking a simple question about the evening service, and Emily responded calmly, her voice steady, her focus clear, not dwelling on what had just happened, but moving forward as if it had simply been part of the day. And that, more than anything, defined her, not the reveal, not the authority, but the way she carried it without needing to display it. And Jason watched this from a few steps away, not intruding, not avoiding, but learning, absorbing. And when the senior manager briefly caught his eye, there was no reprimand, no instruction, just a subtle nod that carried a message clearer than words. This was a moment to grow, not to defend, and Jason understood, not instantly, not perfectly, but enough to take the next step, and he did, moving toward a table where a guest had just been seated, someone dressed simply, someone he might have overlooked an hour ago. And this time, there was no hesitation, no assumption, only presence, only respect. "Good evening," he said, his tone even, genuine, and for the first time that night, his words were not shaped by judgment, but by awareness, and the interaction was simple, ordinary even, but that was exactly what made it meaningful. Because change does not always arrive with dramatic gestures, sometimes it appears in the smallest adjustments, repeated until they become who you are. And as he moved through the room, greeting guests, assisting staff, responding with a level of attentiveness that felt different even to him, the restaurant itself seemed to reflect that shift. The atmosphere not just maintained, but improved in a way that could not be measured in policy or presentation, but in experience, in how people felt within the space. And Emily, observing quietly from a distance now, noticed it, not with surprise, but with recognition, because this was the outcome she had always valued most, not control, not perfection, but growth, the kind that happens when people are given the opportunity to see themselves clearly and choose differently. And as she turned toward the exit, her visit complete, her purpose fulfilled, she paused briefly at the doorway, her hand resting lightly against the cool glass, and for a moment, she looked back, not at the luxury, not at the design, but at the people, the ones who would define what this place truly was long after she walked out. And then she stepped outside, the evening air cool and steady, the city lights stretching beyond the street, and inside, the restaurant continued, but not unchanged, not unnoticed, because something had shifted that could not be undone, and Jason, standing near the center once more, felt it, not as pressure, but as direction, something guiding him forward. And as he adjusted his stance, no longer out of habit, but with intention, he understood something that had been invisible to him before, that true standards are not enforced through exclusion. They are upheld through consistency, through treating every person who walks through those doors with the same level of respect, regardless of what they look like, what they wear, or what they can afford. And in that realization, quiet but powerful, the foundation of the place he thought he understood finally became clear, and though no one announced it, no one needed to, because the lesson had already been learned, and it would remain, not in policy manuals or training sessions, but in the way people carried themselves from that day forward, a reminder that dignity, once seen clearly, cannot be unseen, and once understood, cannot be ignored. The next morning, the restaurant looked exactly the same polished marble floors, the same warm glow of chandeliers, the same quiet hum of early preparation, but something in the air had shifted, subtle yet undeniable, like a place that had been recalibrated overnight without a single visible change. And Jason Miller felt it the moment he stepped through the doors, earlier than usual, his movements quieter, more deliberate, as if he were entering not just a workplace, but a space that now required something more from him than it ever had before. And as he walked past the hostess stand, past the neatly arranged menus and the familiar layout he once navigated without thought. He noticed things he had overlooked before, the nervous glance of a new server adjusting her apron, the quiet focus of a busser carefully aligning glasses at a table, the small details that had always been there but had never held his attention, because attention had once been reserved for appearances, for impressions, for maintaining a standard that now felt incomplete without something deeper anchoring it. And as he moved further inside, the senior manager greeted him with a brief nod. Nothing more, no mention of the previous night, no formal conversation, because some lessons do not need to be repeated, they need to be lived, and Jason understood that, not perfectly, but enough to carry it forward, and throughout the morning. As staff prepared for the day, there was a quiet awareness in the way people interacted. Not forced, not exaggerated, but present, as if everyone had collectively adjusted their understanding of what mattered most. And when the doors opened for the lunch crowd, Jason took his position once more, not as a gatekeeper, but as a guide, and the difference, though invisible to most, changed everything. And the first guest who walked in that day was a man in a worn jacket, his shoes scuffed, his posture uncertain, the kind of presence Jason might have dismissed without a second thought, just 24 hours earlier. But this time, there was no hesitation, no internal calculation, only a simple, genuine greeting. "Welcome in," he said, his tone even, respectful, and the man paused, surprised, not by the words, but by the sincerity behind them. And for a brief moment, something unspoken passed between them, a recognition that respect, when it is real, does not need to be explained. And as the man was guided to a table, Jason felt something settle within him, not pride, not relief, but alignment, as if he were finally acting in a way that matched what the place was meant to represent. And across the room, the staff moved with the same quiet intention, interactions smoother, more attentive, not because they had been instructed to change, but because they had seen something that could not be unseen. And Emily Carter, standing outside once again, unseen by those inside, watched through the glass for just a moment, her expression calm, observant, and as she saw the exchange at the entrance, the subtle shift in tone, the absence of judgment, she gave the faintest nod, not to anyone in particular, but to the outcome itself, because this had never been about one moment, one correction, or one mistake. It had been about what followed, about whether the lesson would remain when the pressure of the moment was gone. And as she turned to leave, blending once again into the rhythm of the city, the restaurant behind her continued, but not as it had before, because now it carried something more, something quieter, something stronger, and inside. As Jason adjusted his stance near the entrance, no longer out of habit, but with intention, he understood something that would guide him far beyond that day. That dignity is not a reaction. It is a practice, something you choose in every interaction, especially when no one is watching. And as the doors opened again, welcoming another guest, the space did not judge, it received. And in that simple shift, the entire meaning of the place had changed, not in appearance, but in truth, and that truth would remain long after the moment that revealed it had passed. By the end of that week, the change was no longer subtle. It had settled into the rhythm of the restaurant in a way that felt both new and strangely natural, as if something that had always been missing had finally found its place. And Jason Miller could see it in the smallest interactions, the way a hostess greeted every guest with the same steady tone regardless of how they were dressed, the way servers listened a little longer, responded a little more thoughtfully, the way even the quiet pauses between conversations felt more intentional, less judgmental, and more present. And none of it had been announced. None of it had been written into policy. It had simply grown out of a moment that forced everyone to see more clearly. And Jason carried that moment with him in everything he did, not as a burden, but as a reference point, something he returned to whenever instinct tried to take over. Because instinct, he had learned, is often shaped by habit, and habit does not always reflect truth. And one afternoon, as the lunch crowd began to thin and the sunlight filtered through the front windows in soft, golden lines across the marble floor, a woman walked in quietly, her clothes simple, her posture reserved, and for a brief second, Jason felt the echo of who he used to be, the automatic assessment rising without permission. But this time, It did not guide him. It paused, and in that pause, he made a different choice, stepping forward with the same calm respect he now offered to everyone. "Welcome in," he said, his voice even, and the woman looked slightly surprised, not because of the words, but because of the absence of hesitation behind them. And as she was seated, Jason noticed something else, something he had never paid attention to before. The way people respond when they feel seen without being judged, the way their shoulders relax, their voice steadies, their presence becomes more open, and it changed the entire dynamic of the space, not just for them, but for everyone around them. And across the room, a young server who had been watching quietly mirrored the same approach with her own table, her movements more confident, her tone more genuine. And Jason realized that influence does not come from authority alone. It comes from example, from the way actions ripple outward without needing to be explained. And later that afternoon, the senior manager approached him, not with evaluation, not with correction, but with something simpler, acknowledgement. "You handled that well," he said, and Jason nodded, not with pride, but with understanding, because he knew it was not about one interaction, it was about consistency, about choosing the same standard every time, even when no one is watching. And as the day continued, the restaurant filled again, conversations rising and falling, glasses clinking, the steady flow of service continuing as it always had, but now carrying a different energy, one that could not be measured in reviews or revenue, but in experience, in how people felt when they walked through those doors and outside, across the street. Emily Carter stood once more, not close enough to be noticed, but close enough to observe, her gaze steady, thoughtful, as she watched the movement inside, the subtle shifts that spoke louder than any report ever could, and she saw it clearly, the difference in posture, in tone, in presence, and more importantly, the absence of something that had once defined the space, assumption. And as she turned to leave, blending back into the quiet rhythm of the city, there was no need for further intervention, no need for correction, because the lesson had taken root where it mattered most, in behavior, in choice, in the quiet moments that define a place long after the moment that changed it has passed. And inside, Jason adjusted his position near the entrance once more, not out of habit, but with intention, his awareness no longer reactive, but steady. And as another guest approached, he did not see their clothes, their posture, or their status first. He saw them, simply as they were. And in that simple shift, something lasting had been created, not just in him, but in the space itself, a standard not defined by exclusivity, but by consistency. And as the doors opened again, welcoming someone new, the restaurant responded not with judgment, but with dignity, quiet, steady, and unmistakably real. Some lessons fade with time, softened by routine and replaced by habit. But this one did not. It settled into the foundation of the place itself, shaping not just how people acted, but how they thought. And weeks later, the restaurant no longer carried even a trace of the tension that had once defined that moment, because it had been replaced by something quieter, something stronger, something that did not need to be enforced to be real. And Jason Miller stood at the entrance as he often did, but he was no longer the same man who had once measured people in seconds, no longer someone who decided worth based on appearance before a single word was spoken, and it showed, not in dramatic gestures, but in consistency, in the way he greeted every guest with the same steady presence, the same unfiltered respect, whether they walked in wearing tailored suits or worn jackets, whether they spoke with confidence or hesitation. And over time, that consistency had changed more than just him. It had changed the atmosphere itself, because people notice when they are treated fairly, they remember it, they respond to it, and it becomes part of the experience they carry with them long after they leave. And one evening, as the restaurant filled with the soft glow of dimmed lights and quiet conversation, a familiar figure stepped inside, unnoticed at first, moving with the same calm presence she always carried. Emily Carter, returning not to test, not to observe, but simply to exist within the space she had built. And as she stepped forward, Jason looked up, their eyes meeting briefly. And in that moment, there was no tension, no imbalance, only recognition, the kind that comes from shared understanding. And he nodded, not out of obligation, but out of respect that had been earned not through authority, but through truth. "And good evening," he said, his voice even, genuine, and Emily returned the nod with a faint, approving expression, not because he greeted her differently, but because he did not, because the way he spoke to her was the same way he now spoke to everyone. And that was the difference that mattered. And as she was guided to a table without hesitation, without assumption, the room carried on around her, unchanged in appearance, but transformed in meaning, because the standard that defined it was no longer about exclusivity. It was about consistency. And as the evening unfolded, the quiet rhythm of service continued, each interaction reinforcing the same principle, each moment building on the last, until it became something natural, something embedded, and Emily observed it all without drawing attention. Her presence no longer needed to reveal anything, because what needed to be seen had already been understood, and later, as she prepared to leave, she paused once more near the entrance, her gaze briefly scanning the room, taking in not the design, not the detail, but the people, the way they moved, the way they interacted, the way they carried something that had not been there before. And as she stepped outside into the cool evening air, the door closing softly behind her, the restaurant continued, not as it once was, but as it had become, and inside, Jason stood where he always had, but now with a clarity that would remain long after the memory of that first moment faded, because he understood something that could not be unlearned, that dignity is not something you offer when it is convenient. It is something you uphold in every moment, especially when there is no reason to. And as another guest approached, he did not prepare to evaluate, he prepared to welcome. And in that simple, quiet choice, repeated again and again, the true standard of the place was finally defined, not by who walked through the door, but by how they were treated when they did. And in the end, nothing about the restaurant's appearance had changed, but everything about its character had. And that day, without announcement, without spectacle, the room had learned something it would never forget, that respect, when it is real, does not adjust itself to the person in front of you. It reveals who you are.